Hey, English 9 scholars, how we doing? Back at it with the Odyssey, and we have, as a class, made it about halfway. And so we've gone through part one, and now we're going to forge ahead onto part two. And the first part of part two is going to start with this sort of little blip here that I'm going to read through with you guys to kind of set up what we're going to see moving on into part two, as well as then, as you can see on the screen here, the first section of part two called The Beggar and the Faithful Dog. So that is what we're going to cover here in this video here. I highly suggest that you follow closely along and don't just listen to me, but follow along the text as we're going. I think you'll pick up more about what is going on in the story as we do that. So here we go. Part two, Coming Home. In Book 13, Odysseus, laden with gifts, is returned in secret to Ithaca in one of the magically swift Phaeacian ships. In Ithaca, Athena appears to the hero. Because his home is full of enemies, she advises him to proceed, disguised as a beggar. This new hero of the post-war age must succeed not only by physical power but also by intelligence. In Book 14, Odysseus, in his beggar's disguise, finds his way to the hut of his old and trusty swineherd, Eumaeus. Eumaeus is the very image of faithfulness in a servant, a quality much admired by Homer's society. The introduction of the so-called servant class as important actors is unusual in epic poetry, and it indicates Homer's originality. Odysseus is politely entertained by Eumaeus, but the king remains disguised from his old servant. In Book 15, Athena appears to Odysseus' son Telemachus, who has been searching for his father. She advises him to return to Ithaca. His, his home, the palace of Odysseus, is overrun with his mother's suitors. These arrogant men have taken over Odysseus' house. They are parting with money from the son's inheritance and are demanding that his mother, Penelope, take one of them as a husband. Athena warns Telemachus that the suitors plan to ambush him. Telemachus boards a ship for home, lands secretly on Ithaca, and heads toward the cottage of the swineherd. In Book 16, father and son are at last united. "I am that father whom your boyhood lacked," the old soldier tells his weeping son. The Beggar and the Faithful Dog. Telemachus returns to the family compound and is greeted tearfully by his mother and his old nurse, Euryclea. A soothsayer has told his mother, Penelope, that Odysseus is alive and is already in Ithaca, but Telemachus does not report that he has already seen his father. The suspense builds as Odysseus, once again disguised as a beggar, finally returns to his home, accompanied only by the swineherd. He has been away for 20 years. Only one creature recognizes him. While he spoke, an old hound, lying near, pricked up his ears and lifted up his muzzle. This was Argos, trained as a puppy by Odysseus, but never taken on a hunt before his master sailed for Troy. The young men afterward hunted wild goats with him, and hare and deer, but he had grown old in his master's absence. Treated as rubbish now, he lay at last upon a mass of dung before the gates, manure of mules and cows, piled there until field hands could spread it on the king's estate. Abandoned there, and half destroyed with flies, old Argos lay. But when he knew he heard Odysseus' voice nearby, he did his best to wag his tail, nose down with flattened ears, having no strength to move nearer his master. And the man looked away, wiping a salt tear from his cheek. But he hid this from Eumaeus. Then he said, "I marvel that they leave this hound to lie here on the dung pile. He would have been a fine dog, from the look of him, though I can't say as to his power and speed when he was young. You find the same good build in house dogs. Table dogs landowners keep all for style." And you replied, Eumaeus, "A hunter owned him, but the man is dead, in some far place. If this old hound could show the form he had when Lord Odysseus left him, going to Troy, you'd see him swift and strong. He never shrank from any savage thing he'd brought to bay in the deep woods. On the scent no other dog kept up with him. Now, misery has him in a leash. His owner died abroad, and here the women slaves will take no care of him. You know how servants are. Without a master, they have no will to labor or excel. For Zeus, who views the wide world, takes away half the manhood of a man. That day he goes into captivity and slavery. Eumaeus crossed the court and went straight forward into the Megaron among the suitors. But death and darkness in that instant closed the eyes of Argos, who had seen his master, Odysseus, after 20 years. In the hall, the beggar is taunted by the evil suitors, but Penelope supports him. She has learned that the ragged stranger claims to have news of her husband. Unaware of who the beggar is, she invites him to visit her later in the night to talk about Odysseus. In Book 18, Penelope appears among the suitors and reproaches Telemachus for allowing the stranger to be abused. She certainly must have warmed her husband's heart by doing this and by singing the praises of her lost Odysseus.